Good morning and welcome to this session when we engage with external stakeholders under the fifth virtual meeting of the Inter-American Coalition for Regulatory Convergence in the Medical Technology Sector. My name is Sandra Ligia Gonzalez, Executive Secretary of the Coalition, and I would like to start by sharing some housekeeping items that will help us run a fluid session. This session is being recorded for its future availability at the Coalition's website. Simultaneous interpretation to English, Portuguese, and Spanish is available. You can choose your preferred language by clicking in the icon with the global icon located at the bottom of your screen. Microphones of the participants are closed to prevent background noise. We kindly request for you to post your questions through the Q&A feature, which icon is also located at the bottom of your screen. For the speakers, we appreciate your turning on your cameras during your presentations. May we maximize the quality of the interpretation to the various languages. So, continuous developing of capacities is an essential component of the commitments that the Coalition strongly holds with all relevant stakeholders in our sector, and this session is intended to advance in this journey. Good regulatory practices implementation in the medical technology sector is a foundational element to the sustainability of any action being taken towards regulatory convergence, as well as not only to prevent the occurrence of technical barriers to trade, but to facilitate access to life-improving and life-saving technologies for patients globally. By learning on how international organizations and regulators are actively promoting and implementing good regulatory practices, we have the opportunity to leverage their experiences while working together, regulators and the industry, to address the challenges posed to the whole ecosystem by the rapidly evolving technology, the changing in public health needs that goes from demographics all the way to the current and potential future pandemics, the insufficient resources, and the required agile regulatory response. We are very honored and grateful to have Alfredo Gonzalez from the World Bank presenting the bank's perspective on the impact that good regulatory practices have on the healthcare sector, and Cristiane Ross Jordan from Brazil's Anvisa, sharing on how the agency has embraced good regulatory practices in their process to develop and update regulations. All of this in a panel session moderated by Renata Amaral, good regulatory practices subject matter expert at the Coalition. And finally, under the Standards Alliance Phase 2 COVID-19 Medical Device Regulatory Convergence Project, MDRC, we have representatives of 4 Colombian government entities who are relentlessly working on capacity building and process development to address some specific needs prioritized to be supported by the MDRC. Susan Suarez, MDRC Liaison for Colombia, will moderate the conversation among the National Planning Department, the Ministry of Commerce, Industry and Tourism, the Ministry of Health, and INVIMA, while sharing their experiences on the collaborative interagencies approach to this endeavor. We want to invite you to take advantage of having this group of experts and make this an interactive session by proposing your questions via the Q&A feature. With no further ado, I'm passing the voice to Renata to get started with the first part of our agenda today. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much, Sandra, for the welcome. I understand we're going to have this panel in 2 languages, Spanish and Portuguese. So I'm going to introduce first Alfredo González from the World Bank in Spanish. Alfredo es consultor senior del Banco Mundial en temas
Alfredo is senior consultant on business environment and better regulation issues with the World Bank. Since 2008, Alfredo has worked at different international institutions such as World Bank, the International Finance Corporation, and the Inter-American Development Bank. And I will also present Cristiane from Anvisa in Portuguese. I understand that her presentation will be in Portuguese. Cristiane Jordan is a doctor with specialization in endocrinology. She's a lawyer and manager in the healthcare industry. She was consultant in UNESCO and other companies on the regulation of the law of healthcare on health ministry. She also worked on the National Health Agency as regulation director, and currently she is director on the Anvisa. So welcome, Alfredo. Welcome, Cristiane.
We're going to begin by Alfredo's presentation on GRP benefits and implications for the health sector, the perspective of the World Bank. Entonces, Alfredo, la palabra es tuya. Bienvenido.
Alfredo, you have the floor. Welcome. Thank you so much, Renata. Thank you so much, Sandra, and the entire Inter-American Coalition for Regulatory Convergency for inviting me to be here this morning to be able to share some ideas with you on good regulatory practices in the healthcare sector. I'm going to share my screen. Give me just 1 second. I don't know if you can see my screen right now, Renata. Yes, we can see it. Okay, great. Thank you so much. So my name is Alfredo Gonzalez. I'm a senior consultant in the World Bank for climate and regulatory improvement. And I'm going to start the first part of my presentation with some general aspects on why it's important to have good regulatory practices in a country for all regulators, including regulators on the healthcare sector. And on a second part, I'm going to go a little bit deeper and more specifically into how we can actually bring this to the health sector. So let's start with a few reflections on why it is important to improve regulations through good regulatory practices. Why is this agenda relevant for countries and regulators? In general, we can say that with good regulatory practices, and in the future, we are going to see what we're talking about, but we can avoid surprises and regulatory failures that may come, or simply many things like a bad design of the regulation when it's being planned, when it's being designed before it is actually implemented. Many times we have surprises because there's not enough public consultation with the private sector or those that are going to actually be affected by the new regulations. In a few countries, we see what we can also call the regulatory capture, where the private sector has a lot of influence and that sector is able to highly influence the content of the regulation on that sector. And also in a few cases, there are failures in regulatory surprises anyway, because we have good intentions on the regulator's side when they want to regulate, but these good intentions maybe are not as well analyzed, and many times the result is not the best. It's also important to mention that the regulation, in this case, they end up bringing more load. So it's important to know that regulations has costs, and these costs many times are necessary to be able to fill out public policies, goals to protect the consumer, protect the environment. And in this case of the health sector, it's clear because these costs that regulation has many times are linked to protecting the health of the users of products and medical devices. However, many times these loads are unnecessary. We are regulating too much and we're putting too much load onto the private sector that are not necessarily needed. And many times we can see this in countries that we can have a lot of loads. So in Mexico, we have a lot of data, and we know that in general, the regulation is represented by 3.5% of the national GDP. And if we see that's actually at a federal level, if we see at a state level or a city level, this is a very heavy load as well. In the Dominican Republic, we also see a similar case, and they found that their regulation represents 5.5% of its national GDP. And just to show a little bit in terms of cost of the regulation, in the United States, it is estimated that federal regulation costs approximately $1.9 trillion. Another key element of why we should improve regulation, we can see this study, which is pretty recent from the World Bank about its Global Investment Competitiveness Report. And it's a very recent study where This is research we do between international agencies, and we see what are the key factors when we try to decide the destiny of these emergents. And usually it's legal and regulatory environment. Those are the most important factors to determine that. So only political stability and macroeconomic stability are more important in the country. So in this case, to improve regulation is very important, as the research shows. And finally, regulation and good regulatory practices became a very important international agenda. So in commercial agreements, in bilateral agreements, modern agreements, these are an essential part of these agreements. An example is TMEC, most recent, because they have an entire chapter on good regulatory practices. There's also content on good regulatory practices on CPTPP, Pacific Alliance, and several bilateral agreements like America and Ecuador, Brazil, United States, Brazil, Chile, Uruguay, and Brazil, Chile. So this was just an introduction to bring some dimension, because we can improve our relationships, but just see what our good regulatory practices consist of and where we can start working with them. So to sum up, the good regulatory practices and the goal that they have is to improve the quality of regulation. And when we say improve quality of regulation, that can be a little bit abstract. How is that measured? What is the regulatory quality? But we like to define that quality regulation is one that reaches its public policy's goals for which it was created in a very efficient way. And from that, this is done through adopting institutions, policies, principles, procedures, and tools that are going to be used for regulatory processes that are much more efficient, from planning regulations to the design and also its implementation and its ex post evaluation once they have already been implemented. So if we go a little bit deeper and look in more detail to what are the key pieces in a good regulatory practices system, we can start by the base of everything, which is having a good regulatory practices public policy. Many countries have this policy. Some are just designing them now and adapting it and implementing it. But it's very important that this policy is actually connected to law. It's connected to something legal. It can be a decree, a law, and another legal instrument, but it can't just be a policy document, a public policy document, because many times that's not mandatory. We need to have this weight where good regulatory practices are no longer an option, but they are mandatory. Then we have the institutions, and here, of course, we have the regulators, which in this case, we're talking about the health regulators, but there's also an organ which is coordinator of policy. Many countries have an institution or a team, a department that is actually in charge of creating policies in a way for the entire country. On the next slide, we're going to talk a little bit more about the tools. On the concrete cases, the most visible part of good regulatory practices. So because we can also show that on a good regulatory practices system, we need to have tools that are going to help plan, design, implement, and evaluate the regulations. It's also important to have procedures, lines that are going to help guide regulators when they produce or review their regulations. Another element of the good regulatory practices system are the same regulation, same entrepreneurial regulation. And in these countries, we also have a lot of digital solutions to help on the implementation of regulations as well as its implementation. And this can come from a small window, a small digital window, until maybe an entire system or public consultation portal or an informative portal. It depends on the regulation and the process that the private sector should actually do in a country. A second ago, I was talking about the traditional tools that we have, and many times when we talk about good regulatory practices, we have references to these tools and we have some contact with them. And on the first step, we have transparency and access to regulatory information. This is very important because in many countries where we work on the private sector and citizens say that they don't know which regulation exists in that country, they don't know what regulations are applicable for my business or my sector. And this can generate a lot of challenges when regulation is being applied. So many countries have developed portals or unique registrations where countries can access and have information about all regulation, all processes on a process in a free way, and what is the regulation of this process that is applied to their economic activity. Then we have the regulatory agency. This regulatory agenda is basically a list where all regulators in the country are going to say beforehand what are the regulatory changes that are going to happen in the next 6 months, 12 months, even 2 years, depending on the country. And this is a public list. And even though it's simple or it seems simple, it's a very important tool to generate regulatory previsibility so that we can see what are the changes, so that the private sector that is going to be affected by the regulation is able to be prepared or early on, and not just be prepared, but also participating in the creation of the regulation. The next two tools are very well known, and they focus on improving the design of the regulations. So one of them is regulatory impact analysis, or AIR ex ante. And this is an analysis for when you're designing regulation to identify what problem is trying to be solved and if the regulation or non-regulation is the best option for that case. And this is when we want to balance costs and benefits of regulatory purposes and, as I said, non-regulatory alternatives. Public consultation in this process is also very important to be able to get everything, the resources from the private sector or who's going to have to comply to that regulation. Once the regulation has been approved and it is ongoing, we try to have regulatory simplification many times, and this simplification focuses on reducing administrative loads. So maybe sometimes that's going to be the tramitation, how these processes are done. The most simple ones, as we mentioned before, digitalizing procedures through what we also call business process engineering, and implementing the regulation as well, and how we can improve and make sure that we have a better fulfillment of that. And at the end, the cycle is closed with the ex post evaluation. And that's basically after 3 to 5 years, where after the regulation has already been implemented. And what we do is we try to see if it filled out its goals, if the goals were reached, if there were any changes, and if it's necessary to change it or delete it completely in some cases. Before going into more detail on good regulatory practices in the health sector, I want to do a brief reflection on how good regulatory practices are going to go beyond your industry. And in this case, I mean the industries in the health sector. And let's see why. Here in this scheme, let's say that in blue, we have all the regulations in a country. This is the regulatory response that is being applied to all companies. Then if we have regulatory improvement in only your sector, which is what happens many times, I'm only concerned with what is applicable to me. And this is very valid, and this is a way of improving the regulatory response. However, we also need to understand that, what is beyond, because this focus is many times in my sector, my industry, and these changes that can be done in the sector differences can be done on a sector where we do have experience, but many times we see that in methodologies for better design and regulation review. This is very important, and we do have a few tools, like I mentioned before, ex ante evaluation, ex post. And for the rest of the environment, it's important to say that we can improve the regulatory surroundings of its sector. In this case, we're talking about the health sector, but there is an entire regulation that is broader in a country, and all of them are going to affect the health sector, even though they're not specific for that sector. These are regulations that are applicable to maybe all companies. And if these regulations are not improved, many times the efforts that have to be done in one sector are going to be valid efforts, but not always the best efforts possible.
Para dar la idea de que
So for that, we can have the good practice that go beyond the sectors to apply the same techniques in a transversal way in the whole surrounding of a country. Now let's have a look at the regulatory practices that we have in the healthcare sector. Why it is important to work on this agenda in this sector that you belong to. So now let's have a look at the perspectives, the good regulatory practices that affect some medical devices and some other products. We start under the assumption that it is a public policy system. We must have a health system that is solid, strong, and consistent on quality and to be safe for the end users. And to take this into account, this is a reflection of the reality due to the products and the medical device sector is one of the sectors that are the most regulated in the country, mainly because of the impact it might have in the healthcare system and for the society as a whole. And then we have WHA, the World Assembly on Healthcare. And we have this text that shows us that it can be a barrier to the access of medical device and products with high quality. And this gives us an idea why it is important to work on good practices in this sector. So once we recognize this, that the regulatory good practices, they foster the safety of medical devices and products. And how to achieve that? As I mentioned before, we use tools to using regulatory impact analysis, evaluations of exports, and in many countries, this is done in a transversal way. And it's very important to have this present in the sector. A good example is the work of the World Bank, specifically in our financial corporation, the international ones mainly. We've been working on that after 2.5 years of a project in Colombia. We are about to conclude it. So this is a component on how to improve the regulatory system we have and improve the regulations as a whole with a transversal view throughout the regulation in the country. In this project, we have a focus on using evidence for the normative impact, ex ante and ex post. Both are very important. So as you can see, we can use good regulatory practices for evaluations and to use the things that we already have from all the regulations we are putting to motion. So as this part of the work we did in our project in Colombia, we carried it out 6 pilot projects. Throughout this project, we worked on ex ante, ex post, electing a specific regulation that would be of interest for the stakeholders and relevant as well. We reviewed it, and using this methodology, we worked with much collaboration, and these are some examples. This pilot project from Colombia, together with the health ministry and IBIMA and MinSalud. So last year we worked on Decree 677, dating back 1995, focusing on registrations, licenses, quality control, health vigilance, of medicine. And we also had the decree 3249 dating back 2006 about diet supplements. And then we noticed that the conditions have changed since 1995, and we have to review our main goals to check whether they were accomplished or not, and check what we have to change in the regulatory system that we have in action. And we did that last year. This year, we reviewed a recent decree after many years of implementation. The decree 3249/2006 related to diet supplements. So this practice in Colombia is a good example showing how the regulatory practices based on the World Bank, we work in a transversal way. But at the end of the day, all the sector has a possibility of working on the regulatory system and also review them together with the health ministry. However, so far we talked about good practices in the regulatory systems under the point of view of the government. What the governments can do to adopt a policy, apply tools. However, we have to recognize, we know that we also have the private sector. We have to reflect what the companies can do in the healthcare system. So this agenda is not only for the government. The regulatory good practices is an agenda for private companies as well, because at the end, they have to comply with the regulation. It's their interest to have these efforts shared and collaboration of the government to improve the quality of the health system for the population. So everything would start with a recommendation of the private sector and be proactive. On the one hand, we have to start having to know the regulatory cycle. It's the governance regulatory cycle, as we call it. And most of the times we think about the participation in the regulatory part only when there is a public consultation, when a regulator leaves and we have to review it, or if we need the comments using different mechanisms to do evaluations for 5, 15, 20, or 30 days, or the days which are common for each country. However, the participation goes beyond that. The participation goes throughout the regulatory processes. You have to participate in the planning to make a change, a regulatory introduction when it's needed. The population should participate as well. And also when there is a regulation and that is about to be implemented, people have to raise their voices so that we can notice the things which are not on track. So this is the first recommendations to get involved, engaged in different processes. Once you know the processes, the stages, the phases, we try to influence since the beginning. It's not only when there is a single idea, we can have many. And we talked about the regulatory agenda, and in many countries such as Colombia, Mexico, we have these too. And once there is this public list about regulatory changes that we are going to perform in the next 6 months, 12 months, I see it as an opportunity to influence in the regulatory system. As a second point, it is important to make a participation that is informed. Just as the regulators, in this case, we are talking about the healthcare regulators, they must use evidence in the regulatory design and when reviewing the regulations, the data, the deeds, not only the government ideas that govern the changes or design of the regulations. So the private sector must also have a participation. The private sector has some advantage. More than the government, the private sector, we see many countries that have more informations used in the regulatory system design. Many times the regulators, they don't count on this information that the private sector has. And this information can contribute to discussions on policies and regulatory processes. So in a collective way, not individual way. In some countries, we see that there are some study centers for the private sectors. It is important to work in a collective way, contribute and participate in these tanks that can be specific in the sectors. They don't need to be transversal ones. They can be collaborative in the healthcare system. This is a way to generate evidence and information that can contribute and support all the regulations in a country. I will wrap up my participation with this example from Malaysia. As a government and private sector can cooperate together, work closely together on the good practices, regulatory practices. So I had the opportunity to work with a team from Malaysia. They have a special group, expert group, to make business easier. It's called Pemuda. Pemuda is a collaboration that is public and private, and they work on the same level, both sectors, public and private sectors, with a single goal: to improve the quality of healthcare and business in the country. So within this view of cooperation in a very proactive way, I mean, a proactive and not a reactive, to take the lead of the regulatory agenda and only having necessary required regulations, not unnecessary ones. And this is on Bermuda leaders. We have a leader from the private sector, a leader from the public sector with the same level of influence. And we have the technical teams that perform good projects, evaluations, specific regulations for a specific industry. And we have the participation of all of them, including companies and government all together. So this is only to convey the message as it is a government agenda, it's a citizen agenda, it's a private sector agenda. So this is an example from Malaysia. It's a report from the World Bank. This is a good example showing that with cooperation, collaboration, we can lead to good practices in the regulatory sector. With that, I wrap up my session. Thank you very much for the invitation to be here with you this morning, and I'm open for any questions that you might have about my presentation. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Alfredo. It was very interesting, your presentation. One of the greatest goals of coalition since we started the work is to bring government and private sector together to exchange experiences, to discuss, talk. Your experience was excellent. Thank you for the example from Malaysia. It's something to bear in mind for the next few years of work. It's really interesting. So thank you very much. Now over to Cristiane Jordan. And before that, I'd like to tell you, everyone, all the attendees, we have the Q&A. It's the place where you can type your question or use the chat as well. And we are at your disposal for reporting the questions that you might have, okay? So Cristiane, the floor is yours. Welcome and thank you. Thank you, Renata. Good morning, everyone. So my greets to Renata Amaral, Dr. Alfredo Gonzalez, Dr. Sandra Gonzalez, and greetings to all the members of the events and everyone who is attending this session today. Initially, I'd like to thank you for the invitation and participating in a so important event about medical device and products. And I belong to the third directory board of Anvisa. And for sure, the regulatory system in the American coalition in the medical device sector contributes with the mission of Anvisa to broaden the access to innovative medical devices which are safe and effective. The sanitary vigilance agency, I'm happy to say that the agency was a pioneer in Brazil, adopting measurements focused on improving the regulatory system. Of course, the achieved results in these environments are a consequence of dedication and commitment from Anvisa, focused on quality, balance, and proportional to the challenges faced by society. More than that, they are needs that are of paramount importance to act in this field because they are very complex and they are led by the agency. To illustrate that, I reinforce some data that I've been releasing frequently. A study carried out by the Brazilian Institute IBGE in 2014 showed us that the economical activities regulated by Anvisa represented 22.7% of the Brazilian economy in that year. We are already in 2021, that is, 7 years are gone. And this percentage for sure increased, resulting from the technological advancement in our economy and great pressure on medical devices. And mind you, the present context with COVID pandemic that brought to society the importance of the agency to come before the greatest sanitary crisis experienced by our society. Before this scenario, it's clear that the regulatory action of Anvisa must be led in an organized and responsible way in order to ensure that the objective of sanitary regulation are covered in a satisfactory way, generating little impact to the related companies and society, preventing losses to innovation, commerce, competition, investment, and economical advancement. Going after this balance, the agency for many years has been implementing strategies, tools, and actions focused on the improvement of the quality in its regulation. So in 2008, the agency was a pioneer in the institutionalization in the improvement of regulatory processes. Since then, we've been maturing in the regulatory practices, and today, Anvisa has a solid structure and a functional framework, ensuring that the implementation of the rules provide enough information to all the legal guidelines, both national and international ones, putting the agency among the biggest health agencies in the world. So the guidelines, current guidelines by Anvisa, they are established by the Ordinance 162 and the Service Guidelines 96, both dating back 2014, 2021. Both rules, norms, they are focused on aligning the guidelines of the federal government, aligning the regulatory model by Anvisa, and legal milestones in the legal sector focused on the regulatory impact analysis, AIR. So together they establish the improvement policy to improve the quality, regulatory quality of the agency. So the improvement of the regulatory process of Anvisa is solid, and technically it is minuted in principles, guidelines that point to the direction in which the agency has been heading for, supporting the regulatory processes, ensuring products, services with more quality, efficiency for the healthcare system and society. With that in mind, our main guidelines going after the best practices in a regulatory part are the acting based on sanitary risk, based on regulation in evidences, regulatory previsibility, regulatory convergency and coherence, debureaucratization, celerity, and simplification in the administrative issues, clarity and rationalization of the regulatory milestones, transparency and the strengthening of the social participation, and the continuous enhancement of the regulatory operations. So these operation models that came into effect in the beginning of this year is structured in four big pillars. The first one is the regulatory planning, involving the definition of the regulatory pillar of the agency. The second one is a framework of a regulatory intervention, from the impact intervention in the regulatory impact leads us to regulatory impact. And the third one is the evaluation of regulatory processes, monitoring and checking the effectiveness, efficiency, and impact of the rules applied. And the fourth and last pillar is the management of the regulatory stock. It's a follow-up process, organization process, revision process, and consolidation of the norms regulated by Anvisa. These work processes are adopted in a systematic way by the agencies, making up the regulatory cycle. This regulatory cycle is a representation of what happens in reality. Once the regulatory process happens in a continuous way and demands planning actions, execution, monitoring, and continuous improvement actions to ensure that the agency offers high standards of society standards.
No âmbito do ciclo regulatório,
If we're
gostaria de
talking about the regulatory cycle, I would also like to highlight work processes that should gain extra attention. Oh, I think I got the wrong slide. Okay, so when we're talking about the regulatory cycle, I would like to highlight work processes that need special attention. First, I would like to highlight the regulatory agenda. The Anvisa's regulatory agenda is a planning instrument for the normative activity that makes sure we have certain predictability on the regulatory actions of the agency. It is a tool that comes from the regulatory agencies and that has more transparency, previsibility, and efficiency to the regulatory action. So we can see that the key word is predictability. Currently, our agenda has 146 regulatory prioritized projects that have a scope, expected results, and programs for its execution. To make sure we have transparency on our regulatory projects, Anvisa has in its website a panel with all the detailed information on regulatory projects that are part of this agenda. Through this panel, you can access general information about regulatory agendas, but also specific information on each one of the regulatory projects that are happening on the agency. Another element that is worthy of highlighting is the Regulatory Impact Analysis Project, AIR, and it's the main process that happens in Brazil now. The regulatory impact analysis became mandatory to edit, change, or really make changes on any normative act following the general law of regulatory agencies. In Anvisa, we've been having the regulatory impact analysis in a systematic way, and it has been happening for a really long time. And currently, we created a structure that will allow for us to have the studies of regulatory impact that are more robust, that have more quality and seriousness, so that we can have the ability to make decisions based on criteria and scientific evidence, which is very important for our agency's actions. The execution on the regulatory impact analysis has a few steps that allow for a correct understanding on the regulatory issues that will be found. The identification of the possible alternatives for handling products, and the rationale for us to think of the most adequate solution, considering effective regulatory measures with the least amount of impact possible for the regulated parties. And this entire process is outlined by important principles. The first one is the involvement of all affected parties and who are interested in that regulation. The second, the regulation based on evidence, with several methods and tools for us to gather the necessary evidence for the best decision. Anvisa has been very innovative thinking and applying design thinking applied to the regulatory impact analysis. This innovation brings a lot of gains to the agency, which has been able to have robust analysis in a creative and dynamic way. To support the technical units in having the regulatory impact analysis, we have several tools of design thinking which are adapted for this need. As a result of this work, we developed the regulation journey that represents a sequence of actions and measures that are built through the evaluation, following all steps on a regulatory impact study. And at the end, from the entire information that was gathered, and this gathering is done through this journey, it is possible to build the regulatory impact analysis report with all necessary evidence that is going to be used by Anvisa's directory board to make the decision. It is also very important to highlight that the entire regulatory cycle has a few guidelines, a few principles from which I should say transparency and social participation are very important. Social participation is a value that Anvisa has on the regulatory measurements design. And therefore, the goals should be able to have public consultation. All meeting minutes should be public consultation. They should be available and they should be there for at least 45 days. And on the regulatory cycle, it is interesting for us to have active participation of society with a presentation of questions and contributions that allow for the improvement of proposals that are being designed by the agency. All information and data related to the regulatory process are available in an organized way on the Anvisa portal. Therefore, it is allowed for anyone who's interested to be able to access immediately documents related to that proposal. Talking about monitoring and evaluation of the regulatory results, recent processes and the ones that are being implemented in the agency. However, certainly with a lot of relevance to make sure we have quality on the regulation. These processes establish the follow-up of the regulatory instrument after its publication, allowing, in that case, for Anvisa to see the effects that came from that normative act, evaluating if the goals were actually achieved, and if there is an opportunity for improvement. In a more specific way, the goals of monitoring and evaluating regulatory results are checking if the norm is effective, and we need to see if there is a need for any review, evaluating the execution of what was planned, evaluating results and impacts that were expected and unexpected, and also the cost-benefit relationship of this standard, transparency towards society, and creating subsidies for the decision-making process. And lastly, I would like to mention the regulatory stock management process. This management is a dynamic and systematic process of organization, follow-up, and review of the standards to make sure we have qualified access to regulatory standards, regulatory framework, to make sure we have an improvement on the regulatory frameworks. And here I will highlight the work that has been done by Anvisa on the review of consolidation of its reviews. And from the beginning, we have had the evaluation of almost 1,300 standards. 800 were edited, and 110 were consolidated. The expectation is that throughout 2022, we will evaluate over 800 standards that can be improved and consolidated on the scope of the revision and consolidation project. To finish my presentation, I would like to highlight that although we have a lot of advancements on the design process of Anvisa regulations, we still have a lot of challenges. In my evaluation, the main challenge is about the calibration of the strength of these regulations. We need to be more and more effective on our interventions that the agency does, trying to mitigate to the max the negative effects. And this is only possible when we work closely with all involved players on that regulation. Following data, ethics, transparency, and collaborative spirit, and understanding that everyone is looking for the well-being and the best health of our society. And I will leave everyone with a reflection that comes from the OCDE document. And it has the recommendations on the Council on Regulatory Policies and Governance, and it's the main reference for the improvement of regulatory quality in Brazil. Quote, a good regulation is essential so that our economies work in an efficient way and at the same time can support important social goals. However, reaching a good regulation is a difficult job and that never ends. End quote. Thank you so much. Excellent, Dr. Cristiane. Thank you so much for your presentation. It was very complete, and we are able to understand Anvisa as a pioneer in good regulatory practices, not only in Brazil, but for the entire region. And we've been having a great experience throughout the years with Anvisa, especially the medical devices sector. So thank you so much. And we are true believers, and we really see the good work that Anvisa has been doing. We have 2 or 3 questions, and I saw that Alfredo already answered one. Alfredo, if you'll allow me to read it out loud so that everyone can hear because they can't see the chat, and then I will allow you to answer as well. This is a question from Viviana Moura. Considering that in Colombia, we're still in the early stages of implementation of good regulatory practices, do you believe we should focus on making traditional tools more mature, or do we have potential for newer things like the use of big data and artificial intelligence for the design and enforcement of regulation known as RegTech and SubTech? Alfredo, if you would like to answer that. Sure. Thank you so much, Renata. Thank you so much, Viviana, for your question. And it's very interesting because many times when we have a view of how we're going to innovate in the regulatory process, sometimes we are still in our baby steps. So this question is basically on this topic, if we should focus on the traditional, which is the beginning and the basics of our regulatory practices, or if we should accelerate and give more steps towards innovation with what we already have with artificial intelligence and big data. My answer is, well, we should work on both. Of course, we need to improve our regulatory practices system with all elements that we have, all foundational elements, these traditional elements, but also the advantage that we have in many countries, which we're just consolidating this and we're learning on the innovation that we have on the other side. So these are important. They are very valid on the complete agenda of our countries and good regulatory practices. And also when I answered, I said 2 topics that are not technologically advanced, but they're that innovative, which is regulation based on results, which is instead of having regulation of command and control, where you tell the regulated what they have to do in a more prescriptive way, just to have our goal, and we give them the goal and we tell them feel free to see how you're going to reach that goal. So this is a way for us to try to make that behavior better towards the regulation and not necessarily having a regulatory process. So these are some tools that go beyond traditional, and it's very important in countries such as Colombia or other countries that have this agenda. Definitely, they also need to advance and work on that. Perfect. Thank you so much, Alfredo. We have questions for Dr. Cristiani as well. A few questions. Dr. Cristiani, are you with us? I don't see her here. I don't see her here. Alfredo, I'll stay with you because there are more questions for you. And maybe soon we'll have Dr. Cristiani again. If you could only have one recommendation for regulators and the regulated sector to improve in the implementation of good regulatory practices, what would that be? Sorry, is the question for me? Yes, it's for you. Do you want me to say it again? Yes, please. Okay, if you could have only one recommendation for regulators and regulated sectors to advance in the implementation of good regulatory practices, what would that be? Well, that's very difficult. It's difficult to have just one, but I would say as a country, I would say one of them is to having a legal mandate to support the regulation. Usually when we have a policy and a regulation is implemented, it ends up being seen as an optional agenda that some regulators can use and some sectors can use. And if I could have a second one, it would be giving more resources for that policy, for that agenda. There's no way we can expect to have better regulation, better regulators, and better results if we don't have the necessary resources to this agenda and this policy. You guys know, and we already have the regulation in the health sector, we need something to, fulfill the public policy's goals. So it's important for good regulatory practices and what we have of financial resources, human resources for its implementation, for it to be successful. Perfect. Thank you so much, Alfredo. Well, I think we lost Dr. Cristiani, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to read the questions out loud and we are going to send the questions to her so that she can give us the answer back at a later time. Let me see. Actually, I think she left. Few questions for Dr. Cristiani, one from Sergio Madeira. Dr. Cristiani, what is the perspective of solving the long impasse between commercialization of non-sterile implants of trauma and the current sanitary norm RDC 156 from 2006? There are very grave cases of companies with legal insecurities with risks to access of population to that trauma treatment. The boxes of instruments and containers of these implants are repeatedly reprocessed all over the world under responsibility of health services to allow the implantation in clean disinfection and sterility conditions. I'm sorry to be outside of your presentation, but I would like to state this urgent cry for help. Okay, perfect, Sergio. And we have two more questions that would be for Dr. Cristiani that I would read out loud as well so that it's recorded. If there are any questions for Dr. Alfredo, he's here with us. So, okay. For Dr. Cristiani, what were the biggest challenges that you passed to get to the current states, capabilities, financial resources, human resources, and others? How do you make sure that all these processes are being executed correctly? They are included in their quality system, quality management system on normatized or auditable procedures. And the last one, we know that Anvisa makes social participation possible on the first stages of the regulatory process. Could you explore more tools such as subsidy, public subsidy? These questions were for Dr. Cristiani, and we're going to send the questions to her. She had to go to another appointment that was urgent. Do you have any other questions for Dr. Alfredo? You can use this time if you want. Specifically from your presentation, Alfredo, I thought everything was very interesting. But one topic that we are very concerned about on the medical devices sector is the regulatory load on import of products. Other sectors do go through the same challenges, but I think that the medical devices sector specifically, even given the size of the supply chain and everything that is happening around the world, I believe it's a sector that is specifically impacted by regulatory issues on the final price of the product when it reaches the consumer. So maybe if you could talk a little bit more about that, I think that's an interesting topic because one of the goals, and specifically my role in the coalition, is to bring to the table regulators and negotiators, everyone who works in import export, so that we can talk about these topics in a way that everyone's together. So international trade, because how much the regulatory issue can impact or completely restrict in some cases the commercialization of goods on medical devices sector. So if you want, it's just a brainstorm just for us to talk about that a little bit. I would like to use your participation here, and I know that you have a more global view on the World Bank on that matter. So if you want to talk about that a little bit, I'd appreciate it.
Claro que sí, Renata, con mucho gusto. Sí, el tema
Of
comercial.
course, Renata, it's a pleasure. So the regulatory good practices, they are really important. We have to look at two aspects regarding medical devices. So we have the tariff part that can increase the prices and so on. This is a part of the parts that must involve everyone who participates in the foreign affairs environment. It's very important to have a look at all the barriers and the scenarios, the technical barriers in commerce, and CAPA has its technical regulations that impact in the way that they manufacture these products, and there are many specifications for medical devices that can affect their entry in some countries. So under this topic, the recommendation is when there is a forecast of these kinds of regulations, we have to look at the international standards in order to have homologation and the technical implementations to see what the products require, and looking at the international standards, the good practices that other countries apply. This can help countries to standardize and make the commerce easier, mainly on medical devices sector. So this happens in the country, many countries. It's something broad, not only in the country part of the country. The technical regulation that affected this type of products can be homogeneous or standardized with good practices implemented. Excellent. We have a question by Gabriela Gaham from Chile. As Alfredo said, we've seen that implementing good regulatory practices require effort from the country, coordinations among several ministries, and together with the private sector. What would be your recommendation to create instances for dialogue between public and private sector? Yes. Thank you very much, Gabriela, for your question. So my specialization is in the World Bank and the regulatory public consultancy. So this is the first to have this consultancy, and then open the regulatory processes to all the actors. So this is taken into account very seriously so that we can have an open dialogue among both sectors, private and public sectors, and also engage citizens. I think it's very important. And we shouldn't have the traditional view of this public consultancy, only talking to regulatory teams. And see if I answer or not the comments brought up. So in my presentation, I mentioned the regulatory agenda. Dr. Christiana mentioned that that the regulatory agenda is very important to have a forecast of what is coming ahead. So we evaluate the impact of the new regulations, and then we come up with a proposal. When the design is done, we are about to implement it. It's important to talk about what is being done with the existing regulatory processes. So the World Bank, we have the public consultancies, then the company, citizens, the government, they have the opportunity to have access to all the proposals, all these data. And it's a cost effectiveness way to make everybody to participate in it. And it's different from traditional dialogues such as work tables and forums. So we take into account the public consultancy. This is the main idea, and it's a powerful idea. To add to that, from the government point of view, we've always talked about the homogeneity in the regulatory sector. We have this view that many times the regulator doesn't have all the information, and when we open this consultancy, it's a way of acquiring more information. And this regulator, sometimes they have a fixed rule or view, and this process make everything more flexible. So many times the public, in the government sector doesn't have all the information. So that's why this public consultancy is important. Excellent. We have a last question by Sandra Lydia. To you, Alfredo. Do you know if any country report the compliance results of foreign affairs regarding regulatory practices beyond TBT or OMC?
Gracias, André. Muy buenas preguntas.
Thank you for the question, but I don't have any country in mind that does this kind of report. The countries that we work with and the countries that works with the World Bank, they have this agenda, but it's more incipient. Probably in Mexico, for example, we have more advanced regulatory practices there, and they have these annual reports about the conditions of the regulatory process in the country. So Mexico, I think, has the best practices on this, but there isn't this kind of compliance segment for notification. And I strongly believe that it is very important so that we can measure the success of whatever was implemented. Going back to Malaysia, they have these annual reports, but it's not mandatory, this policy. It's more optional, but it's very important to see how everyone is complying with the agenda. So in the regulation we want to monitor the good regulatory practices. When we check the legal mandates, if everyone is complying with it, and then we evaluate each sector regulator to make a public report recognizing those regulators who have the best practices in regulatory systems and have more room for opportunities. And this generates incentives. Excellent. Thank you, Alfredo. Thank you very much. We knew that your presentation would be excellent, and it surmounted our expectations. Thank you, Dr. Christiana, who had to leave us. Thank you very much. Sandra, over to you. Thank you very much, Alfredo, and all the participants, the attendees, for your questions. And now, over to Susan Suarez from OCDE projects and the regulatory convergence in the government of Colombia. And she can introduce the attendees, the participants in the next panel. Susan, thank you. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. I'll be leading this panel, as Sandra said. I'm from Colombia in the Regulatory Convergency Project. It's a pleasure to be in this panel right now with you, Colombia, with the purpose of integrating the organization in this field and the recommendation done by these organizations. Since 2014, we've been working strongly on the normative policies and fostering the policy institutionalization, strengthening the decision-making based on evidence. This is to get ahead with strategies focused on strengthening the economical and social areas. The first is establishing the required institutionalization, working on the capability of management and implementing tools in this normative environment that we have seen that it's required uh, inside these policies. And fourth, having lines, guidelines, and also developing mechanisms and tools to these 5 strategies. They are the strategies from Colombia for the public policies throughout the years since 2014. Today, when we share these strategies focusing on this area and having cooperation among the agencies that have been participating the broadening processes, and we have all the evaluation about the medical devices and all the effort and all the importance of this collaborative work. Thank you very much to all the panelists that helps us. Maria Jimena she works in Colombia's university, and she counts on a master's in public policies, and currently she works in the organization model of planning, and she's a leader in this sector. She has been working on social and public policies and participated in design and frameworks of public policies. Maria Jimena, welcome. The first question is, why is it important in your point of view to work on these monitoring of the effective policies in the country? Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Susan, thank you for inviting me to this space. It's very important to discuss what Colombia has been doing in their regulatory policies. Before what you said, Susan, the country has been implementing a policy that we started in 2013, developing the documentations, 2014, the policies, and then we've been implementing some tools that before we didn't use them in the country. And there was a normative impact. And recently, in an incipient way, the re-evaluation of everything that we do. Before the question you asked me, and so many things to take into account in the last 2-3 years, this work has been really strong. This strengthening work to evaluate all the sector in the country, and then we could start implementing the learning and the lessons learned that we experienced from the regulatory implementations, above all in sectors as healthcare. That is very important for the concrete cases. It was a milestone for the project that we have seen. We've been following an evaluation process, decree 4525/2005. It has to do with this regime on medical devices, and decree 3770 dating back 2004 for sanitary research in vitro, and they are really relevant. And they are milestones for several topics. Number one is the pandemic that you've just mentioned about the intervention that you performed. And that this brings a scenario that this regulatory convergence topic covers a great importance in many countries. And the countries, by doing that, can strengthen up and face up to these shocks, impact that we have in emergency situations, and then we can solve these issues the best way possible. One of the topics that we have insisted and we've been working in our country is this regulation of emergency, these emergency and contingency projects. It's done under big quality standards of complying with the regulatory best practices and understanding the different contexts that are not really adaptable. They are not the same. And they most of the time take longer than normal processes. In Colombia, we highlight that we've been working strongly with different entities to implement these tools. And then we can say, the department gave us the mention to lead the implementation of the policies, regulatory processes in the country. In Colombia, we don't have a centralized body that is in charge of implementing all the tools and lead all the tools, other than be the head of several entities, bodies, implementing these tools, mechanisms, processes. And then we act as articulators, as liaisons, and we've been generating technical teams in different, they are experts in with different ministries, entities, with the support of multilateral supports. Alfredo talked about these evaluations that have been done in the country. We have 6 in total with different bodies, entities. On the one hand, they start doing this evaluation exercise of the regulations that take a great deal of time in effectiveness, and we have to analyze the impact that they have, and we have to bear in mind the strategic sectors of the countries, and so we have to monitor everything to see all the impacts, and also see if this regulatory new regulation belongs or not, is pertinent or not to what we need. So we aim at that, and we try to generate these capabilities in the entities, in the bodies, and it has been a really interesting exercise. And we've been following up these external stakeholders in order to follow the whole process so that the entities can carry out all the evaluation, the planning in a more homogeneous way. We've been following these exercises on quality, leading entities as a way to retrofit this exercise and also learn from these experts and help in the implementation of these tools. With that in mind, we've been generating the capabilities, skills, and we have these milestones, which are these follow-ups that we do together with these entities. On the other hand, we from this department, we've been leading a strategy of capability generation, and also other tools that have been articulating with other entities that I mentioned just now, to lead other kinds of policies. So in this strategy of generating capabilities, and together with the planning departments, we create a timeline developing the strategies, and we've been achieving support of all these entities that add to each other. So these exercises that we do, they are really good. So another important topic to address here that we've been leading, and we take into account the performance that we've been having, and based on all the measurements that have been carried out by OP, and the participation of public policies and all the actors that participated in the design, as Alfredo said just now, and used a term that is more specific for the regulatory system. We've been working on that as well. And this participation exercise and involving different stakeholders in these milestones in the building of the regulation, it's extremely important to strengthen the regulations. So to cover all the issues, the problems, bridge the gaps that come up from the society and different actors. And it's important to highlight that we have a tool that is the unique public consultancy system that we've been carrying out this consultancy with different entities as a pilot. And now we have these that started working last year. And we have 15 or 16 entities, international and the national ones, that have been using this tool as a consultancy and have been participating. And with that, we centralize this exercise. We are betting in that, and everybody has been working together to make it the platform, a single platform that all the entities can do their public consultancy, traceability, to have transparency, to be dedicated to citizenships and comments and observations that are done during the creation of the framework of different regulations. With that in mind, from our country, we've been working in an articulated way to strengthen up these sectors and implement all the good practices tools to improve the regulatory policies. And currently we have a process of updating this process since 2014, actually, because of several reasons. First of all, we started this process, and we have already some schedules, timelines in the country about the regulatory sector that are not included in the first planning that we started in 2014, and we have to take action and implement these measurements in order to point out these other ones, these other lines that are strengthening up in the country.
Fortaleciendo, digamos, cada vez
This is
más.
what we've been working with, what we've been strengthening and generating capabilities inside the entities. I would also like to highlight on the National Department of Planning together with CAF. This year, we were able to have the first contest of good regulatory practices. And in that contest, we had, let's say, our initial intention was to be able to get to know a little bit of what is being done at a national level as well as a territorial level in terms of policies. We opened 7 categories, out of which obviously we had normative impact analysis, public consultation, among others. And we got over 50% registration. We had 17 entities present, and it was very interesting. It was great exercise. It was after November 16th in Bogota. And from this exercise that we did, we got to know the initiatives that are happening in the country. And in another way, and if we hadn't done that, we wouldn't have known what was going on. But also, it was also very helpful to identify the entities that are leading and strongly helping the implementation of these tools. From this contest and the participant entities in this contest, what we want to do is next year we want to have practice communities with these entities to try strengthening, identifying all the aspects that need more follow-up, that need a closer look, and also strengthening what we can to be able to continue moving with the implementation of the policies in the country. So in that case, Susan, I wanted to tell you that in Colombia, we've been working a lot. We've been trying to implement, strengthen, and continuously improve the quality of the country's regulations. And the final goal is to try to strengthen and improve conditions on society in general. And maybe the last thing I would like to highlight, I think that maybe now you're going to mention it a little bit more, is from this year, based on Decree 1478 last year that was updated, the National Planning Department is doing an exercise with technical concepts about the methodology of normative impact analysis that have been developed in the country with the creation or modification of technical regulations. This is being supported with these criteria of good practices, good regulatory practices, and it is very useful for an exercise that is necessary, and it helps us improve and strengthen the framework to try to generate these capabilities that are going to allow for the country to implement or develop a normative impact analysis. So that's a little bit of the context that we have. We've been working with that, facing the policies, and maybe now I would like to make way for Oscar and my colleagues to be able to tell their stories. Thank you so much, Maria Jimena. It was very interesting. It's a great opportunity to get to know what are all the projects that the National Department of Planning is working to try to improve the regulations, all the challenges that we've had, and everything that you guys have been doing in terms of following these changes, these capabilities of our technical teams that are specialized. They want to participate in the impact analysis that are exposed, the tools that you have delivered, collaboration as well, and all collaborations that are going to follow that line. So thank you so much for your participation, and we invite everyone who's listening to ask their questions in the chat, or actually the Q&A section, so that we can answer them at the end of the panel. Now let's go over to the representative of the Ministry of Health, Oscar Marin Diaz. He is a physicist engineer. He studies physicist medicine, and he works with nuclear technology, security, and radiologic protection. He has experience in activities related to policies of radiologic protection and the control of risk factors, and he's part of the technical team that started the resolution where we have the use of protection products, just like having protocols for diagnosis, to CT scans, and currently he is the representative and coordinator of medical devices in that area from the Ministry of Health. Oscar, thank you so much for your participation. Thank you for coming. And I'm going to start by asking you a question. According to what you said, Maria Jimena mentioned everyone who's been working and the entities, we saw that they also need to implement in terms of the policies and normatives that exist in the country in Colombia. Why do you think it's relevant to have the ex post evaluation in this specific case of medical devices that are being done between the Ministry of Health and the Institute of Vigilance? Thank you and welcome. Thank you so much. This space that we have here, it was very interesting, and it's been fostered by this collaboration. Thank you to the coalition. And well, basically, it's interesting to have this type of resource. So this generated a lot of capabilities on our side, which are very important. Talking specifically about the analysis, we started the implementation a long time ago. 3770 came in 2004, and 4725, which is specific for medical devices, came from 2005. So around 17 years when they started. So we've had a lot of spaces. The market of medical devices has a lot of different areas. And here we move a lot of money. This is an area that moves a lot of money, and it has a lot of great innovations happening in this sector. Well, for more specific medical devices, this comes from the need that we are having on the health management crisis in many countries. So naturally, organizations should be more flexible to try to understand how we can actually cope with the security requirements and the efficiency as well. Talking about the types of medical devices, or any device for that matter that you may have in your country. Sorry, Oscar, I'm going to interrupt you. We're having some issues with the translation. Maybe there's a little bit of noise. Maybe that's better for the translators to be able to translate. Perfect. Maybe the problem is the location of the computer, because I'm against the light as well. Well, the point is that the devices and the applications that have been happening over 17 years, and no one thought that that was going to happen. So it was 20 years or so. We want to have this on our medical devices. This is something very normal, even though we're spending more money on it as well. This is the way that we've been having everything. The main thing is trying to understand what is happening, and if these conditions, what we have in these regulations, if these conditions are applicable. And not only the market dynamics, but also what I want to do, which is the main function of the Ministry of Health. It is generating and making sure we have the health conditions to each of the persons that are actually going in the health system. This is the first topic that we have seen, and it's one of the main reasons to be able to have this evaluation. So it's understanding what these interventions are that started 17, 16 years ago, and if they still have a good response to the health needs that are coming from the country in general and the ministry. When we talk about interventions, we not only talk about this of sanitary requirements and records, but we also see how we're doing this compliance, the requirements that we have, so that we can have tools for that. There is an important topic, and in the ministry we generate normative policies, but we have INVIMA, which is our technical organ. And it's interesting to see how we can mine interesting policies that have responses. So it's important to know how to support and strengthen the technical deadline that we have when we're talking about sanitary vigilance, so we can get an answer for that. And we see what is happening here. For this type of problem, this is what we have, not only in national terms, because we have all of our national commitments, but also what this dynamic is doing at the moment. One thing I already mentioned, and at this moment, over the last couple of months, because of the COVID-19 pandemic, we understood that we had a series of positions, but first, a framework that came as an answer for security and efficiency, and also more flexibility for any type of medical device that can be used. especially in emergency interventions. That is a situation. And probably in our close event of our regulation process, we mentioned a situation where we had the necessity of getting more requirements. And this is, of course, going to have a response of the entire regulation on the ministry. What we can have is an answer, an immediate answer, or something very quick to this type of requirement. We also understood that these the ex post evaluation process in our country, at least, and for the health sector, they are being done following a methodology that probably is not structured. So the way that we've been doing this and the need that we've had for resolution of technical regulation, this is the part of the experiences and the processes, the petitions, and everything that we do through the different means that we have to be able to manage that. However, it wasn't the process in a systematic way. So at that moment, we would gather information. We understood which sector there was a problem, a health problem, because of the use of devices, which maybe was possibly could be mitigated by regulation. And then we go to that. This technical regulation, this resolution, but it wasn't something that could easily be done, because we know that for the medical devices sector, this regulation didn't have these changes. But let's say that we did have that, so that could be improved. But now, using these tools of ex post evaluation on a clear methodology and positions that we can have these topics that in 17 years were created, we wanted to highlight. This is the way we were able to do this. This is a very important topic for us to have this planning and these interventions that we had. Thank you so much. Thank you, Oscar. And just like you mentioned, the needs will change throughout time. Each decree will have to be updated. We have to have planning, making sure that's happening for the patients, and doing this in a systematic and consistent way. And of course, what you mentioned in terms of the necessary articulation between institutions to have all of that technical capacitation that will allow them to analyze what are the needs, what are the solutions, and with the situation that we have because of the pandemic. Thank you so much for your intervention. And now we'll go over to the next question. And for that, I'm going to welcome Lucia. Lucia Ayala is pharmaceutical chemist. She is a specialization in the market, and she has been working for over 25 years as a professional in sectors public and private as medical consultant and management of regulatory issues. She is an advisor on vigilance, techno-vigilance, environment, and intellectual property in the pharmaceutical sectors on medical devices. And currently, she has the role of medical devices and other technologies on the National Institute of Vigilance in BIMA. Welcome, Lucia. And the question for you is the following. Why do you think the articulation of institutions is interesting, like what Oscar mentioned? Thank you. Well, first of all, thank you so much. Thank you for this presentation, Susan. I would like to say hi to all my companions on this panel, Maria Jimena, Oscar, you, and Sandra Ligia, of course. I would like to say thank you to the Inter-American Coalition for Regulatory Convergence. Thank you for the invitation. Why is it important for us to have the interagency articulation? First of all, it's important because the different institutions actually have different levels of expertise. They have different knowledges, they have different competencies, and they are complementary. And because it's important for all of us to work on the implementation, to share the input or the analysis information. It is important because this way we are able to learn to see with which eyes we see everything. This evaluation of regulation on the health ministry, see this from this point of view, just like what they had and in BIMA, which is the Institute of Vigilance of now it's the actually the Colombian National Food and Drug Surveillance Institute in BIMA. And in Colombia, the health ministry creates the standards and does the analysis of normative impact and this ex post evaluation usually. And at this moment in BIMA is innovating because the direction of the board of medical devices is innovating and they're having the ex post analysis. And that's why this articulated interinstitutional work is done. And that's the same as teamwork, the teamwork that needs to be done in any industry or in any institution that needs to have multidisciplinary work because there is a merge of knowledge, there is learning, and each person is dedicated to their topic, to their competence and their expertise. And the rest is not worried on topics that we don't know. So we don't worry about topics we don't know. In BIMA talks about specifically about medical devices. We don't know anything about sanitary registrations because we have other places to do that. We have other agencies. But of course, the ex post evaluation is much more multidisciplinary, and we need to have everyone else on international commitments and everything else.
Mil gracias, doctora Lucía.
Thank you,
Importantísimo lo que
Dr.
usted-
Lucia. It's very important that you mentioned these topics, how different these works are. It's a very important change, and the importance among the technical teams, legal teams, and other teams regarding the legislation and international affairs commitment, and undoubtedly, this multiple knowledge will strengthen up the valuations, documentations, regulatory parts, as Oscar said, to update them and meet the expectations and needs of a country. Thank you very much for your intervention. And now, Mr. Nunn, there's another thing that I'd like to add to what I've just said. So it's that Colombia, since we prepared the standard, the norm, as Oscar said, 17, 18 years ago, from this moment on, we work in multidisciplinary teams and interagencies. We work together with the Pan-American Agency of Health that came to the country and emphasized everything that we need, as we have giant medical devices in the hospital without the maintenance that are needed. And they supported us and showed us the globalized world, and it was a teamwork that we shared the translation of the documentation, including FAA, to choose the global alignments and create our legislation. And then we, Colombia, regarding the medical devices, we were not talking about good practices in regulatory sectors, but we had the teams with the industry, Pan-American Agency on Health, among other ones, and we built up a very good, robust decree. And I have meetings with Colombian business people who export. They give us this retrofit and they tell us that we are very close to what they need, and they were able to export to the world, register new medical devices, and we have this legislation that is very close to the needs. It's something recent, and as we are talking about good practices in the regulation. If we work together with our stakeholders, we've been doing it for a long time and having good results. Thank you very much for this intervention, and we see the regulatory policies that started back then in 2014, and we have some background information that we needed that weren't transparent about the public policies, private policies, and little by little we have been delving into them and adding other topics without the justifications, reports that are required. And we have been improving that throughout the time. And then thank you very much for your participation and for all this information. So next, Hernan. He's a representative of trade and the tourism industry sector, and he is a candidate of a master on public policies in Rosario University and has been working for over 12 years in industry and trade industry in Colombia. And today he's a coordinator of the group as an expert and has been a witness of these 12 years that we have been evolving regarding this topic. Thank you, Hernan, for your participation. The question is, what are and what will be the biggest challenges to face in this sector, in the institutions? Oscar talked about the standardization of the practices to intervene in the technical regulations that allows us to organize the legal topics, both national and international ones. Thank you, Hernan. Welcome. Thank you, Susan. Good morning, everyone. Uh, all the attendees who are here, thank you for the invitation once again. So I'd like to tell you that Colombia has always been strong in the regulations, good practices, the same way as the industry and the trade industry and the technical regulation in the country, and following all the recommendations from countries such as Mexico, and as Jimena Alfredo said in the beginning of their presentation. So following the compliance of the international recommendations. And in order to do that, it was necessary to bring them to Colombia. So the World Trade agencies and all the other bodies that we have got in touch with in other countries, and we embodied them to our national legislations using the Decree 1595. This decree, dating back 2015, is not only the general milestone of the technical regulatory system and organization in Colombia. We have more. We have all these good practices that we've been talking about today, that we see not only that what is mandatory, what isn't for Colombia, the normative impact, so that the regulators, they can have evidence, objective evidence to mitigate a problem, a risk that they are under with a medical device. This is the technical regulation. And based on that, we improved it. And this decree 1595 makes us, all the regulators in Colombia, everyone who does technical regulations, to publish data as a regulatory agenda. So in this case, it's for technical regulation. In the last Commission of Quality every year in a meeting, intersecretarial one on quality, it's a meeting that we assist all the regulators. We are there for them. And In the last commission that was held last week, all the regulators were talking about the impact analysis in the regulatory sector, what we are going to do in 2022, what we are going to do the year after, and the technical regulations that we are going to carry out this year. As Alfredo said, it's for the companies and the stakeholders sectors to feel, or in other words, to be bound to the sectors working together so that we know what we are working with, and then we can have more participation of other regulators. For example, I am interested in working in this working group. This is a transparency movement that we started for the technical regulations. So this is the regulatory agenda focusing on quality. And this decrease, 1595, it was a milestone for us, as I said. It established the minimum alignment that we must take into account to work in regulations, having working tables, having active participation, manufacturers, traders, importers, exporters, compliance. We have association of consumption, consumers, we have the agencies of control, and then we start preparing this technical regulation document. It might have a lot. The 1595 decree gives us minimum conditions, but each ministry can standardize each movement according to their needs, but we might have these minimum recommendation, these working tables, these nationwide publication to receive support from the national industry. Likewise, within these good practices included in this decree 1595 gives us this concept, even the Ministry of Tourism, to follow all the technical regulations. So all the regulators should go through this concept. We look at the three pillars. For example, to have transparency that is paramount, to see if the technical project was published nationwide and the requirements came from international standards as a reference, preferably, and evaluation of all the technical regulations. So once this previous concept is issued, we go to another instance, which is the international notification. Before the countries, you know about that, I'm sure of that, and the countries should be at least there for 60 days. We have the agreement of the countries, and then we check the competence of the industry and trade. These 4 or 5 steps are the minimum, the least that we must have for a technical regulation creation. So it's recommended 8 steps, but the minimum are these: transparency, impact analysis of the norms, national impacts, international trade, and competence. With that, we intend to have a standardization in the preparation of technical regulations and proceed with transparency so that we can have the participation of all stakeholders. With that in mind, and looking at the technical regulation, we know it's a process that is continuous and acquire more and more good practices. And that's why we adopted the 1595 decree. And now we have 1468 decree. Why we haven't updated it? Because our production process is a little slow, because we demand only one normative impact analysis, international impact consultancy, and now we want to do it in a broader way, mainly in the trade sector. So it was necessary to update this 1595 decree. We did the same with 1468 with normative impact analysis, among other things. So a simple one and a full one. The simple one we use it for specific cases. When the changes, they don't bring impact for the regulators. Our procedure, we analyze the compliance, we can go from the third to the first part, or when we decrease some requirements, or we make changes that don't bring much impact for the citizens. And then we use this normative impact analysis, the simple one. But if the situation is more severe, we use a full analysis, impact analysis system. When we increase the requirements, we include the products, we change our compliance standardization from the first part to the third part, it makes a difference or bring the impact to the citizen. This is a full impact analysis. So there are two impact analyses that we have, as Maria Jimena said. We do it with follow-up of the National Department, DNP. They created some guidelines, taking the regulators hand in hand, and we issue a technical concept at the end. And likewise, with 1468 decree, what we try to do is to decrease this period of international period because it would take 90 days, and the World Trade Commission demanded 60 days. The least we had 90 days because we wanted to have the Andina community because there was a report about 2552 that said that the international notification would take 90 days. So it was recently updated a year ago with the resolution going through this notification period to 60 days. So what we had to do is to get this notification period, and we used the 1468 decree to expedite, to accelerate this process of technical requirements analysis. With all these practices, what we really try to do is to have some transparency periods for manufacturing, the technical regulations, and we try to have less negative impacts as possible in a transparent way, having less opposition from the citizens, and we can see that on OMC, and Colombia wasn't affected because we complied with all the good practices in the regulatory part. Thank you very much, Hernan, for your intervention. I'd like to highlight everything that you said, that Colombia is in this ongoing process to establish conditions for what kind of analysis to do. It's very important what you said. You talked about the international reference to comply with the international affairs that we have acquired throughout the years. And undoubtedly, this statement you made, the part of participation and having transparency, it's very good in order not to have surprise at the end of the negotiation. And now a last question that is open to all the panelists, that we have a very short time. I invite you to ask the last question, and I have it. So in Colombia, since the political constitution, we've had increasing participation, and we have the bylaws, and all the entities, they are more and more engaged and embodying all the citizen participation, the private public sector, and our focus is to improve the regulatory processes. In your point of view, what are the recommendations to keep up the advancements in this topic, going beyond the public consultation, notification you mentioned? What are this bet in order to forge ahead in the publications and give enough answers. So now it's open for all the speakers who want to answer this question. So first, Dr. Lucia, Maria Jimena, and Hernan to wrap up this session. And I also invite you all to send your questions, okay, so that we can answer them. Okay, thank you, everyone. Thank you, Susan. The part of the new strategies focused on communication, social networks, webinars that we have seen so far that are being pushed ahead by the pandemic. I would say that it's very important to have these strategies implemented so that the stakeholders are aware of all these informations through webinars, inviting the whole industries, importers, exporters, medical device companies, so that we can let them know what we've been doing and the reason why the steps we are taking. And we could have some tips from them because each of the pages of the institutions, they have communication tips. For example, we have preventive actions, informations. We could focus on that or create this kind of communication so that people can know what we are doing, that we are on this phase, this process, and then when the moment comes to participate, to give opinion, we know that it's something that has been happening and they start preparing themselves with their comments. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Now let's go over to Maria Jimena. Thank you, Susan. Yes, I think that very aligned with what Lucia said. It would also be very important to have a bit of a community in systems, which is generating and promoting the best practices around this topic, not only at a national level, but also at an international level, to be able to exchange experiences, getting to know other experiences as well, getting to know these actors as they advance, and not only getting to know that information, but it would also help to articulate a lot of what we could be implementing and what we do in this convergency process, regulatory convergency, and cooperation as well in these processes. Thank you so much. If the Ministry of Commerce wants to finish. Sure, just to complement a little bit. When this tool is mandatory, when it is in production, and it's what Maria Jimena was saying, which is the system for consultation, it's going to be very useful actually, because all citizens and everyone who's interested will have to, they will know where to go, where to try to find the regulation process if they need it from any ministry. And we all know that when we're talking about technical regulation, that's mandatory. And we obviously need to give a response during the notification process. And everything we get on the international notification process, need to answer all comments, but very few ministries do that on the national consultation period. The Ministry of Commerce, as we can see, has this good practice in a voluntary way of basically publishing during the period, publishing information that is received. But this is being done in a voluntary way. So meanwhile, it is mandatory. That's going to happen, but it's a great practice. And we've seen that when I see it, we have more participation, we have a smaller negative reaction of that administrative process. So all of this is very helpful. And we are sure that we are going to overcome all those inconveniences that we've had. Thank you so much. Thank you to you, Lucia, Maria Jimena. Now we are at our last few minutes for an answers of a few questions. The first question that we have She's saying thank you so much to the panelists. And I'm very interested in listening to the clear focus in the interinstitutional work focused in contributing safety to patients. How can we make sure in parallel that in the implementation of this methodology and the update of decrees 4725 and 3770, how can we make sure the immediate changes that do not wait should be done to make processes easier for vigilance and control and for them to have minimal requirements? This is the first question that we have. Now you can answer. Ministry of Health, Dr. Lucia, if you want to answer that one, please feel free. Damaris asked that question. I believe there's an important point here of understanding that this process of normative impact and analysis is implemented at this moment at an institutional level. And any documentation that we have to deliver to be able to have modification needs to have contact with all the steps. So these are some verification topics that we have that will allow to indicate the inputs and the verification of the documentation. Likewise, on our health ministry page, we have a part which is the regulatory agenda. So anyone or any entity can start at any moment and see which projects, which activities we are doing at the moment. And it will allow them to define and make the regulation be done in the next few days of public consultation and for everything to be fulfilled. And this is a great point, considering all the information that we have and everything that we've gathered during the process, like the concepts and the information that is all indicated in there. So we already have all of that in our system of receiving quality on our ministry, each one of those for regulation. Thank you so much, Oscar. I don't know if Dr. Lucia wants to complement the answer or if we should go to the next one. Thank you, Susan. What is happening is, so INVIMA is able to do something different, as we mentioned at the beginning. The health ministry is the one that creates the rules. So I think the Maris's question was mainly guided towards the Ministry of Health because of the changes of standards that we need to be able to update our legislation. But thank you. Thank you, Dr. Lucia. We have yet another question. This is very in line with what we just asked. And it's, what is the challenge and what strategies do you think should be used so that there's consistency between theory and practice? It was a question from Marisol. And another question about these topics is, what are the biggest challenges in your consideration that Colombia is facing at the moment with good regulatory practices to be able to use this recommendation related to the regulatory aspects and to be able to have the regulatory processes and making sure that they are efficient and with resources? What do you think these are? What are the biggest challenges that we have, considering what you just mentioned, in terms of what we have to go and advance in this way so that everything is impacted in these processes? What are these biggest challenges for us to have now on these resources and institutions, human resource or terms, in which aspect we'll also have that, considering that we have the policy, what are the strategies for that? Oscar and Maria Jimena raised their hands, so Maria Jimena, please go ahead. Thank you, Susan. No, a little bit with the previous question. Let's say, I don't want to contradict theory and practice. Here, that and with the challenges of this question, I think there's two topics. First, specifically, everyone goes through generation of capabilities of the entities that when we are implementing the tools, not only because they should be implemented, but because they actually have a goal to have on the quality of the regulations. And in parallel with that, we believe, and it's one of the topics that from the recommendation of the trade organization, we understand that more than just making it mandatory, the policy, maybe by decree, let's say tomorrow we have to have all the tools. It's also about being able to generate this incentive and these spaces where we're able to have this competence and this necessary capability, but also creating context. Because obviously when we have these policies and the tools that should be done, this can be quite traumatizing with the implementation, because all the tools should also be adapted to our context and our specificities and generating these capabilities as well. So this is one of the main challenges that we have in the country with policies in general. And one of the topics that we should approach as well right off the bat, which when we're talking about theory and practice.
Le doy la palabra a Oscar.
Thank you, Oscar. Over to you. Do you have anything to add? Thank you very much. So these are the things that we've been doing here. It's part of the process. We can say that when the project started to be executed, carried out this year, we didn't know the groups that and people that we would work with. We did the process to pick out the people that we are going to work with, people who could add to the group to make this institutional work. BNP, DIMA, coalition of the foreign affairs, trade, and we wanted to have a very focused work, working on the transparency process and to share our knowledge among our peers. It's really important with the whole ministry, healthcare agencies, following the methodology the best way possible so that we could get to the conclusion of this project and understand well all these evaluations. Thank you very much, all the speakers, for answering the questions. We would wrap up the panel today. Thank you for sharing the experience from Colombia. And we are going to invite more people to share their experience and everyone to share it with everyone who is attending. Okay, thank you very much. Now, Lucia, and thank you all the speakers. Thank you, Susan. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for remaining here online. We surpassed a little bit the time. And now thank you very much. As Susan said, thank you for the participation of all the speaker group. And thank you very much, Alfredo Gonzalez, Cristiani, that unfortunately had an urgency. She had to leave the meeting. And we know about the commitments that we have. We have to keep on supporting the works, keep up these talks, initiatives, strategies to develop the capabilities that enable us to operate in a more efficient way in all the regulatory process. And after all, they put us together in this commitment to ensure that the patients in the region can count on medical devices which are safe, have quality, performance level that is required to comply with its role. And thank you very much for your participation. And thank you for the commitment and support that is continuous from you. And in this region, let's capitalize the experience, institutions. And with that in mind, we know that we count on you to be able to count on your experiences for future events. Thank you very much and have a great afternoon, you all. Thank you. See you soon.